Graphic designers use a lot of different file formats depending on what they're going to be doing with their graphics. If they're going to be putting the graphic on a website or on some other type of screen, they might choose JPEG or GIF. If they're going to be taking their graphic to a commercial printer, they might choose PDF or TIFF. Depending on what the printer specifies. And if they're continuing to work on their image or graphic, they might use the native file format, Adobe Illustrator, or which is AI, or Adobe Photoshop, which is PSD. But understanding the range of different file formats that you might potentially use is really important when starting to become a graphic designer. So all files have a specific size that they are, and the sizes are measured in bits, bytes, kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes. A file that is in the byte range, for example, if you have a file size that is, let's say, 600 kilobytes, is pretty small. It might be really appropriate for the screen. A file that's going to be printed might be measured in megabytes. You could have a file that's 10 megabytes. That would be maybe a good file to print. Gigabytes, usually you don't see files for print or for graphic design in gigabytes. That's usually reserved for someone that might be doing motion graphics, using video potentially. That could easily get you into gigabyte range. If you have a lot of video you're editing, that file that you save, your Adobe Premiere file, for example, might be in the gigabyte range, or it could be in the megabyte range, but it would be significantly larger. But graphic designers, for the most part, if you're printing an image, it's usually in the megabyte range. And if you're putting an image on a website, it's usually in the kilobyte range. There's raster image files and there's vector image files. So raster images are constructed by a series of pixels, and you can see these little pixels down here, little tiny units of color, and these form the image. So JPEGs, GIF, and PNG are all raster image types. Every photograph that you find online or in print is a raster image. And photograph meaning something taken with a digital camera or something scanned in, like a digital, an old photograph that you have of your grandmother. If you scan it in, that's going to be a raster image composed of pixels. And pixels have a defined property based on their resolution. And the resolution is either high or low. And the problem with raster images is that it's hard to make them bigger once you have them in the computer because they become distorted or blurry. So maybe you've noticed it if you've ever downloaded a file from the web and then you open it up and it looks a little bit just not good anymore. That's because maybe it's not the proper size, or it's not looking good at that size on the monitor. So in order to retain pixel quality, you really cannot resize or upscale raster images without compromising resolution. JPEG is a really common raster file format, and it's probably the most common bitmap-based file type you run across on the web. And they're known for their lossy compression, and which means that the quality of the image decreases as the file size decreases. So when you save something as a JPEG, you're basically sort of throwing out a little bit of the information so that you can make the file size smaller. And this is important because if you open up a file in Photoshop and it's a JPEG file, and then you resave that file as a JPEG, and then you open it up again and you do something to it and you resave it as a JPEG, every time you save it as a JPEG, you're going to get a little bit of that lossy compression, which after a while can really make your image look mushy and not good. So you probably don't want to save files over and over as JPEGs. You would stay in your native file format, Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Photoshop, until you're done editing, and then you would save it as a JPEG when you're completely finished. So vector image files are more flexible, and they're constructed using proportional formulas rather than pixels. File formats that are vector are EPS, AI, or PDF also supports vector. And they're perfect for creating graphics that require frequent resizing because they can be small or large without interpolation. So if you have a logo, you're always going to save that logo or create that logo with a vector software like Illustrator, because you potentially want to resize that logo. And if you created it in Photoshop, you really couldn't upsize it after you created it. So it's much better if you use a program that supports vector when you're creating these graphics that need to be scaled. PDFs, this was a file type invented by Adobe with the goal of capturing and reviewing rich information from any application or any computer with anyone, anywhere. So PDFs are great because what you can do in Illustrator or Photoshop is, let's say you have a file and you want to share it with somebody that doesn't have the software. So if your friend or your client, for example, doesn't have Photoshop, you would save the file as a PDF that supports either vector or raster, and then you could show that file to your client as long as they can open up PDFs. And PDFs are really easy to open if you download the free Acrobat Reader software. So they're designed for anyone to be able to download the Acrobat Reader software and open. And this is by far the best universal tool for sharing graphics. And then also what you can do with a PDF that supports either vector or raster is you can reopen it up in the software that you created it in. So if I had an Adobe Illustrator file and then I saved my file as a PDF supporting vector, I could then reopen that PDF in Illustrator and edit it, and it wouldn't be compromised at all. So it's really terrific for designers who want to share their files and then continue working on them potentially. So you can see vector art close up. You're not going to have that pixelation because there's no little dots of information like there are with raster files. There's no pixels. And so it's a really different way of working. Sometimes you're going to work with raster, usually when you're working with photographs. Digital paintings, for example, might have to be raster because there's so much color information and detail. If you have a really detailed graphic or image, you might need it to be a raster graphic. But then anything that's more flat or an illustration, for example, would be a vector graphic. So there's resolution that you have to deal with when you're working with raster graphics. And resolution is measured in either DPI or PPI. DPI stands for dots per inch, and PPI translates to pixels per inch. And these units of measurement are essential for determining the density of the pixels in an image. And websites, for example, optimal resolution for a screen-based image, which is typically low resolution, is 72. And optimal resolution for a print is 300. So you can see how there's a difference there. If you look at an image on the screen, 72 PPI at 4 by 4 inches, let's say, it's going to look great. But then if I were to print that image out at 4 by 4 inches, it would look horrible at 72 PPI. And so I would need a much bigger file to get a really high quality print. And then resolution is also tied to file size. So the more resolution you have, the bigger the actual file size is going to be. So this is kind of how you see it in terms of your file. If you have an Adobe Photoshop file, for example, it's going to be measured in DPI or PPI. Usually PPI is for the screen and DPI is for print, but they both mean the same thing. And if you say, for example, my file is 5 DPI per inch, what that means is exactly what I'm showing you. It's 5 pixels down, 5 pixels across. And in Photoshop or Illustrator, you have, you're going to be thinking about that file size. But in Photoshop, which is a raster program, you're also dealing with those pixels, the resolution, and the PPI or DPI, dots per inch. And so in Photoshop, they have the dialog box that you open up that shows you the exact size of the image in terms of the file size. So this image is 7.32 megabytes. The pixel dimensions are 1386 by 1385. The size of the image is 19.25 by 19.236 inches at 72 ppi. So what that's telling me is if I were to print it at 19 inches by 19 inches, it's not going to look very good because it's 72. But if I change this to 300, the width and height would need to get smaller, but then it would be a good printable file. So it's also important when you're scanning images to consider resolution because everything scanned starts out as raster. There is a way to take imagery into Illustrator and vectorize it, but when you start out, you're going to be scanning it raster and you're going to be determining that PPI or DPI when you scan. So it's best to really think about what your intent is for the image when you're scanning or when you're taking it as a digital photograph so that you make sure it's the proper resolution, it's large enough to do whatever you need to do with it. If it's too large, you can always downsample it. It's not going to hurt it. But if it's too small, really hard to upsample, it's going to make it look soft and it's not going to have the quality that you want it to have. So that's kind of resolution, file formats, just an introduction. We'll be talking more about this as we kind of go through this course.